Üzülerek söylüyorum. Milletimizin
I say with regret that a handful of minds are trying to usurp the will of our nation by abusing the police. The security forces of this country have messed at the door of my home, homes of 16 million Istanbulites. Hundreds of police are masked. We are facing bullying, but I want you to know that I won't be undaunted. I love you all so much. I entrust myself to my people. Let all our nation know that I will stand upright.
Hepinizi çok seviyorum. Ben kendimi milletime emanet ediyorum.
I will continue to fight with that person and his mind, which uses this whole process like an apparatus.
Aparat gibi kullanan aklıyla mücadeleye devam edeceğim.
We just watched a clip of Istanbul Mayor Ekrem Imamoglu addressing his followers and supporters as police were gathered outside his home this week to arrest him. Turkish President Erdogan's decision to move against the popular Istanbul mayor and his main political rival has thrown Turkey into crisis, putting his authoritarianism on full display and raising the question of whether Turkish democracy itself is under arrest. I'm Thanos Davelis, and welcome back to the Greek Current Cafe as we tackle this question and more with Henri Barkey, Lisel, Hintz, Nicholas Danforth, and Endy Zemenides. Henri, I'm going to pass the ball to you first. CNN ran a headline this week after the arrest saying Turkey is now one step closer to quote them, endless Erdogan rule. Is this Erdogan's most serious attack yet on Turkish democracy?
Well, there are so many to choose from, but it is probably the most serious one because he did something really extraordinary to arrest the most popular leader in Turkey and 105 other people on made-up charges. So, yes, it is the most serious attack. And actually, we'll talk about it, but it may be the end of Erdogan, too.
That's a bold statement there. Lisel, what do you think about that comment, that this could be the end of Erdogan as well?
So I think this is both, I think Henri framed it nicely. I think this is both perhaps the biggest assault on democracy, although I would say that Turkey hasn't been a democracy by the standards that we would define it for a very long time. It had fallen into what we would call a competitive authoritarian regime, but when you take the competitor off the playing field, it's not really competitive anymore. So I think it's a major assault. I think we've been seeing it coming for a long time, but I do agree that the fact that you feel the need to take the main competitor off the field, in addition to tilting the playing field with media restrictions and, judiciary interference and all that kind of stuff, signals weakness.
Nicholas, this arrest has sparked a strong reaction inside Turkey, and we saw reports of protests erupting in the streets. The main opposition is talking about a coup, while Erdogan may be trying to project that he is, in fact, in full control. Is he really revealing a weakness here?
Yes, I think what's clear is that they wouldn't have made this move if they thought they could continue to win elections in the blatantly unfair, but still nominally legitimate way that they've been winning them up to this point. As Lisel said very well, they've been tilting the playing field further and further. They've been making it more and more uneven. But on that tilted playing field, Erdogan was still winning elections, quote unquote, legitimately. And Imamoglu's candidacy had the risk of putting that to an end. This was someone that if they'd run head to head, even in an unfair election, even with all the media manipulation, even with all the other legal games Erdogan's played, this is someone who would have beaten Erdogan. So the fact that he felt like he had to take the step of arresting him, I do think shows, that he thought he needed to step up the authoritarianism to another level. I don't think there's any turning back from this. You can't go back to the kind of moderated competitive authoritarianism that Erdogan had working for him anymore. At this point, the fear is that you only stay in power by continuing to crack down further and further. That's a very ugly process. That's a very dangerous process. One that hopefully that ultimately will end with the end of Erdogan, but it remains to be seen how ugly things get and how long that takes.
And, this seems to have been in the making for a while, and we've seen different moves from, invalidating Imamoglu's university degree, even, taking away his bachelor's degree. What do you make of this Erdogan playbook?
Look, I put these two books behind me because in fascism, Erdogan was chapter 11, and how to lose a democracy is largely about the Erdogan experience. But you're right, it's forever. Henri just talked about made up charges. He knows what Erdogan's court system, how easily they use made up charges. We still have Osman Kavala. Somebody's got to explain to me that case, other than Erdogan just wants him in jail. Demirtas. An ironic thing, since you brought up the invalidation of the degree, Erdogan, the person who's continued to occupy Cyprus, invalidated the degree because he said that a university in the occupied northern part of Cyprus was not recognized. But he was going to lose. He lost before, as Nicholas said, in an unfair election. He lost before. And this should raise questions about whether he would have lost last time, but for the horrible candidacy of Kılıçdaroğlu. And this, I will say, to bring the American angle to this reminds me a little bit, because we saw Erdogan, this whole Erdogan-Trump phone call and bromance. This a little bit reminds me, and I'd love to hear everybody else's take on this, of Erdogan's last visit to Obama's Oval Office. That when he was at that point, Barack Obama doesn't remember it this way, but I certainly do. Through Barack Obama's first term, Erdogan was his golden child. He spoke to him more than he spoke to any other ally. And then he came to the Oval Office and Gezi Park broke out and everything changed. And it's remained changed. Turkey's image in the United States has remained changed since then. And I'm wondering if this is going to be Erdogan's Gezi Park in Trump's America.
Well, let's get some takes on that. Henri, what are your thoughts responding to Endy?
Look, I don't think this is comparable to Gezi Park. I mean, they're two very different incidents. We still have to see what the opposition is going to do. What Erdogan is banking on is complete and total repression. Look, first of all, the elections are not due until 2028. So he's taking action 3 years in advance of that. The Kurdish peace deal, which now is, I think, in danger of coming apart, was designed to get him to change the constitution so that he can run again. Now, the Kurds may not go along with this anymore. So Erdogan basically is now banking on, I think, something very different. He's going to go after Imamoglu. There will be a major reaction in the country. He is going to declare maybe a state of emergency. And under that, I don't know the legal provisions of that, but maybe either not have elections or change the constitution on the basis of that. I mean, he is going to do something dramatic. This is only the beginning, right? And I think this was planned a long time ago. I think the Kurdish peace process was supposed to also reduce the, shall we say, the criticism of Erdogan, because, you know, he will go around and say, we still want the Kurdish peace process. Look, we're making progress, to reduce international criticism maybe of this. So he's playing many different balls. He has many different balls in the air at the moment. But I think what's going to happen is that those balls are going to hit each other in the air and then come crashing down, probably in a spectacular way. This is only the beginning. I mean, we have to essentially tune and watch an amazing political show. This is very unusual. I mean, I should also say the White House reaction is going to be critical. And if Trump is behind him all the way, then he's not going to get away with it, but it's going to be much more difficult, obviously.
And the original and the initial reaction, initial statement was garbage, you know, which was, we'd like Turkey to honor human rights, but we're not going to comment on the internal decision making of a country. It was lousy.
Yeah, I mean, before we get into that, I saw Lisel was nodding earlier when Henri was giving his explanation here. You know, Henri just said that this is just the beginning, but this is something that we've seen kind of escalate to this point over the last years. What else should we expect?
Well, I tend to nod when Henri is making statements. It's a habit of mine. I mean, I definitely would say that this has been in the works for a long time, and I would say that Erdogan has been testing the waters. I think that he, you know, we've seen over 150 pro-Kurdish mayors, democratically elected pro-Kurdish mayors, removed largely in Turkey's southeast. Extremely few Republican People's Party mayors, just a couple. And when those individuals were removed, they were called terrorists. So they kind of use that vilification brush that they like to use. It's either PKK, now it's Daesh KPJ, the Revolutionary People's Party Front, something along those lines, right? So a leftist organization. So there's definitely been ways in which they've been seeing how they can remove mayors and kind of get away with it. And I think that there is a lot of anti-Kurdish prejudice in Turkey that's allowed them to get away with removing pro-Kurdish mayors for a long time. And I've kind of always said that Imamoglu was going to be the catalyst. That's going to be the one that people are going to rise up for. And in a sense, it's kind of sad that there's not that same amount of outrage when a democratically elected mayor in the Kurdish region is removed. But obviously the stakes are higher with someone who was poised to be the opposition candidate. And I think the timing here is really important. So the groundwork has kind of been laid. You know, there have been multiple, again, kind of testing the waters, attempts to see what the government can get away with. I mean, how many court cases and indictments and accusations has Imamoglu faced, right? From insulting the Supreme Electoral Board to links to terror organizations, to being part of a corruption organization, right? So they're just kind of finding all the different ways in which they can, A, delegitimize him in the eyes of the public, so maybe reduce the difficulty of removing him, and then also kind of build up the case against him. And so I think that all of those steps have been in place, and then the moment is now, right? The primary for the Republican People's Party is on Sunday. And so this makes sense that they're going to act now. They're going to remove his diploma, and then they're going to detain him. And then let's look at the international community and kind of the environment right now. And I'm sure my colleagues have more to say about that. But I do think the incredibly tepid, I'll maybe use the word tepid response from the United States is not surprising, right? In the sense that you're not going to get criticism of moves against democracy from an individual who is moving against democracy. Right. There's a network, a transnational network that supports the installation and the consolidation of far-right authoritarian leaders, far-right populist authoritarian leaders. And so I didn't expect anything coming from the United States that was going to disrupt this. So I'm sure my colleagues can also talk about the European environment, but it's not surprising to not see condemnation coming from the US at this point in strong words.
Nicholas, I want to pull you in here because, you know, Lisel said something interesting, that Imamoglu could be the catalyst here for people to, you know, take to the streets. And we did see the protests, as I mentioned earlier. Do you think this move could galvanize the opposition and Turks who care about democracy regardless of party?
I mean, that's what it's going to take. Look, as an American citizen who believes in democracy, I would have deeply wanted to see a much stronger response from the United States government. But I'd be forced to admit that historically, even if we had a president in the United States who believed in democracy, we probably would have gotten a pretty tepid response, and it probably wouldn't have shaped Erdogan's thinking. If he felt like he had to do this to stay in power, he would have done it. Still embarrassing that the United States isn't. But I think what we've seen in history is, realistically, you know, what keeps Turkey a democracy is the Turkish people's belief in democracy. It's not a European pressure. It's not American pressure. Those things help. But it really is. It's going to be in the hands of, obviously, the opposition, how well they respond to it, and then how well even people who've supported Erdogan, you know, respond to what really is, as Lisel said, just another level in the assault on democracy. Mm-hmm. I think at some level, what I'm sure Erdogan's hoping is that by arresting Imamoglu, he can trigger some kind of conflict within the CHP. He can trigger some kind of factionalism, break down the opposition, and allow him to keep manipulating things without really having to get more authoritarian. So far, at least, the response suggests that isn't going to be the case. Again, I mean, you do have people across the political spectrum in Turkey who realize what a serious line this is that's being crossed. And again, I think they will respond accordingly, and we'll see what happens.
Endy, I want to turn to the international stage a little bit. I mean, we brought up the State Department response. The EU also issued a statement of concern, which wasn't surprising, saying they were hugely concerned about it. And there's this great page on Twitter.
Deeply was there. They went from very concerned to
correct.
deep.
Deeply, yeah. There's a great page on Twitter that asks, "Is the EU concerned?" And they pull a word from the statements each time, and it's either deeply, hugely. But looking at these responses,
it would be great to see what the translation is in each of the official languages.
Some might be sterner than others.
But you know what? I'll take that statement and put it aside, because I have not been impressed with the foreign policy team of the new European Union leadership. But at the same time, we see that the EU excluded Turkey from the EU defense funding mechanism, which is something the Turks the last week have been, we're in. So they're out. And then Germany, which is making all kinds of news of being more assertive on the defense and security front, was much harsher than we've become accustomed from in Germany, from Berlin. And so those were a couple brushbacks. The one thing that I agree with Nicholas, the U.S. administrations never have great responses to Turkey. But like what got kicked off in Gezi, I remember that week, because John McCain, who had never been critical of Turkey up to that, came to a conference where I was at, and Elliot Engel was there. And I remember Elliot Engel saying, I sat down with Erdogan. This guy was the most arrogant, narcissistic world leader that I've ever met, and I've met them all. And John McCain went on MSNBC immediately following, ripping on Erdogan. Last week, we covered on this program a congressional hearing that I thought was notable, that only one member of Congress, Joe Wilson, spoke favorably about Turkey. Everybody, they say, okay, they're an important ally, but they use their version of concern. Everybody uses concern. It must be we should call this the concern episode. But when you got Tom Barak was nominated officially last week, so we have that hearing coming up. We have all kinds of hearings coming up, and I think this is a chance for Congress changed the U.S. policy towards Turkey last decade. Let's remember that Donald Trump did not want to put CAATSA on Turkey. He spent 3 of his 4 years not putting CAATSA on Turkey. He eventually put the CAATSA sanctions on Turkey because Congress was going to force his hand in the NDAA. So we really need to see what Congress is going to do.
Andy, this Congress is different than the last Congress.
It is, absolutely.
This Congress is not going to do anything Trump doesn't want them to do. Look, the most critical actor here, it's not U.S. government, it's not Congress, it's the economy, it's foreign investors. The Turkish lira collapsed yesterday, and I saw a report from Barkey saying, "Oh no, it's going to come back up. It's solid, etc." Today, the stock market in Turkey again the trading had to be stopped. Right? Nobody in their right mind will invest in Turkey where there's no rule of law, and this really shows it. So why would you put your money in Turkey if you know that from one day to another Erdogan can take it? I mean, he took Imamoglu's companies over today. So that's going to be the most important factor. And the other thing I want to say is that what happened yesterday is one in which Imamoglu is going to be in jail for a very, very long time. He's not going to get out, right? Because the indictments, especially when you're accused of terrorism, they fill the indictment with so many details that no lawyer for the defense can even get to those details, because you have to fight every single detail. I mean, Lisel mentioned some of the groups. I mean, every single group under the sun is essentially going to be mentioned. So you have to defend. You can't get through in the indictment. So what I think is going to happen is that Imamoglu will stay in prison, right, with the hope that CHP will find some lackluster individual like last time to run against Erdogan. But I don't think it's going to work this time. I really don't think it's going to work this time. I think Erdogan. The other thing, one more thing. Remember what happened in 2019, and this is something that Erdogan must remember. Municipal elections, Imamoglu wins against Binali Yildirim by a sliver, 30,000 votes, right? So Erdogan finds a reason, of course, he orders the Supreme Electoral Council to say, no, redo the elections, fraud, right? They redo the elections. Imamoglu wins now with 1 million votes difference, right? So Erdogan knows this very well. So he knows now that he has made a martyr of Imamoglu. So there's no way Imamoglu is going to run against Erdogan because he already was going to win. Now he's going to win by 80% almost, right? Because people are so sick of tired of. So for that to happen, Imamoglu has to stay in jail. Poor guy.
Well, Henri, you brought up the economy, and I want to turn to our other panelists here for their take too, because it seems like the last decade the economy hasn't really moved Erdogan that much. I mean, we've seen his unorthodox policies for years tank the lira. It seems that it's not, leading him to change any of his authoritarian tendencies. So how critical really is the question of the economy?
Before they answer, let me just underline something. Mehmet Şimşek, the economy czar, actually was doing a good job. Right? The Turkish economy was turning around. Its balances, foreign exchange, current account balances had improved a great deal. So yes, there was an improvement. Sorry, let them answer.
Sure. Maybe Lisel and then Nick, if you want to tackle this.
Yeah, happy to. And I would just jump in on Henri's point about kind of making Imamoglu a martyr. And no one knows better than Erdogan how powerful martyrdom is, right? So he gets arrested for reciting a poem when the welfare party that he was a part of, gets kicked out of power. And there's a purge of anyone who's suspected of being an Islamist or having Islam-leaning tendencies. And that narrative allows him to be able to rally an entire base that feels as though they were victimized by military tutelage and a Kemalist secularist regime. So he knows the power of that martyrdom, and I don't think Imamoglu is coming out for a long time either. On the economy, I agree that I think the economy was kind of slowly starting to improve under more circumspect management, let's say. But I think a lot of people weren't necessarily feeling the effects of that yet. And I think that a lot of people at the 2023 elections thought, how is it possible? How is it possible that Erdogan wins when there's so much inflation, when the people have not had the earthquake recovery measures that they've expected? Like, the government didn't seem to handle that very well. How is that possible? And I think it only was possible because the opposition wasn't able to put forward a convincing front. Candidate, yes, but also, like, who are you going to trust to rebuild your city after an earthquake? A group of 6 parties that can't agree on a candidate, can't agree on pretty much anything, and are struggling and tussling for power in there, or someone who's been in power and has the connections and has the patronage and has all that kind of stuff and has control over the institutions already. So I would just say, I think that the economy would have played a bigger factor in 2023 had we not sort of had those two issues, kind of the issue with the candidate itself and the issue with the trustworthiness of the opposition coalition to be able to do anything that the population would have wanted. So I think that Erdogan is now seeing, oh, now there's a candidate. Now there's someone a lot of people can rally around. Here's the charismatic person who can reach out to all of these different constituencies that Kılıçdaroğlu, for a number of reasons, was not able to, personality aside. And I think this is my threat, and so I need to move on it.
Nicholas, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. I don't claim to understand economics. I don't know if this will lead to an immediate crisis or just a continued worsening of the situation. But in either case, it does seem like, again, it just makes it harder and harder for Erdogan to maintain even a veneer of democratic legitimacy. And it's going to mean, in order to stay in power, the crackdown, the authoritarianism is going to have to get more ugly, which will only make the economic situation worse. I mean, you've seen in the most recent elections how, in response to the economy getting worse, Erdogan has tried to securitize politics, make it more focused on domestic terrorism, on Turkey's international battles with the West or whoever else. And again, it seems like this makes that dynamic even more inescapable going forward.
Endy, I want to zoom out a bit, place this into
well, let's stick with the economy, because I think he's overconfident with the economy. It seems like has saved him. There were bread riots before he started taking these measures. And Erdogan, it was just a few years ago that he was assaulting economic orthodoxy by saying he had record high inflation and he thought that Turkey has to be cutting interest rates. And then when inflation went even higher, he found a way to blame Jews for it. All right. And he doesn't realize how vulnerable Turkey's economy is right now. And since Trump is in power, let's remember that Trump almost crashed the Turkish market with a tweet about two very minor officials. He wasn't going to, and there's still the HALC bank case. There's a lot of stuff out there. And if there's breaks, if the EU says what's going on in Turkey is going to affect us even starting to talk about EU membership, I think he's a lot more economically vulnerable than he thinks he is.
I want to zoom out a bit from the economic chat as we approach the end of our chat, and look at this in a global context. It looks like we're in a new age where strong men around the world feel fully empowered to act without any fear of consequences. And, back in 2021, Anne Applebaum had warned that, the bad guys are winning, to quote the title of a piece she wrote for The Atlantic, and included Erdogan in her list of authoritarians. Maybe this is a question for everybody here, but has this piece turned prophetic? And we can kick off with Nicholas here and then move on.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the results, I think, in terms of both domestically strongman leaders getting more powerful around the world and the predictable international consequences. You've seen, be it in Israel and Ukraine, you've seen a new disrespect for international boundaries. You've seen the US president now openly discussing ethnic cleansing as the American policy in Gaza. I mean, there's a new level of lawlessness on the international stage that people predicted, people said was going to be the consequence of the breakdown of democracy around the world. We're seeing it. It's ugly. And again, I try to stay optimistic, but it looks like it's going to get worse.
Lisel, what's your take?
Yeah, I agree. I think I and a lot of my colleagues and analysts have been talking about kind of a hyper masculine populist nationalist strong club for a long time. And I think we've seen not only the rise domestically, but as I was saying earlier, kind of the transnational networks. A member of the board of trustees of New College, Florida, went and hung out with Viktor Orban for a while, right before the abolishment of the gender studies program there. There are actual direct diffusion networks that are happening in terms of spreading ideas, tactics, support, and so forth. So I do think that's something very concerning. I think a lot of these leaders are kind of using almost like a anti-imperialist rhetoric to kind of criticize the Western liberal international order, so to speak, and say this has been set by the West and we need to push back against that. So they're kind of rallying domestic publics behind even some of the transnational or global dynamics of this. But I'll say, people aren't completely immune. And we've seen after months of protests, Serbia's prime minister resign yesterday. And what I think is really important to understand about protests is that there's always a catalyst, right? There's always a spark. Mm-hmm. There's always something that gets people to the streets. And if Erdogan maybe made one mistake, I think it was that they went for the diploma before they went for Imamoglu and detaining him. Because what you do by going for a diploma is you put it in a university frame. And I think that the youth were going to show up for Imamoglu anyway. But I think when you take away a university diploma and you kind of it hits them in a visceral way, like you saw people at Istanbul Technic University, all these different universities saying, "What, are you coming for my diploma too?" And so it just hits this wider, broader sense of lingering resentment. And that's what happened in Serbia, right? It was the collapse of a train roof, but it was corruption and it was frustration with rule of law and all of that. And that's what's happening in Turkey is, yeah, it's about Imamoglu, but it's about so much more than that. So I do think there's a worrying rise, and I think it has global implications in terms of far-right populists, but they're not completely immune. And I think Serbia is a really interesting example of how sustained protest can shake a government. We'll see what happens afterwards. That's always the question, right? Because there's one thing about a person resigning or policy concessions being made, but does that actually lead to sustained regime change is another question entirely.
Henri, anything to add on this?
Yes, I never taught what I've written, and I don't like to compete with an Applebaum, but I just found it the other day. I wrote a piece that I had forgotten about for the American Interest in 2019 called Springtime for Autocrats, a play on that famous movie. But look, this has been coming very slowly, and we've seen it. The signs were there of this authoritarian. I mean, in part, it's a backlash after the Cold War. I mean, the end of the Cold War has had a major impact because the Cold War kind of disciplined, maybe not necessarily in the right way, but disciplined political systems. What is interesting with many of these authoritarian leaders is that they're so self-confident. They know everything, right? Trump knows the military better than generals, he said, right? Erdogan is the same thing. He knows economy better than economists. He knows everything. And they're all surrounded by yes men, and men they are. So they will make mistakes. And as a result of what happened in Turkey yesterday and last few years, I would say, is that you will have protests. The regime is going to repress them, but somewhere they're going to make a mistake, right? Somebody is going to be shot by mistake, or a tank will roll over somebody else. I'm just making things up here, but accidents happen. Right, and that will trigger a much bigger wave. One other thing I would like, and this is the way of bringing the Kurdish issue into our discussion. I never thought that the Kurdish peace process that has started was really real, because how can an authoritarian leader like Erdogan make peace? Right? He doesn't believe in it. So one of the consequences of this is if the protests in Turkey get far more serious and he feels threatened, expect that he's going to go into Syria. He's going to try to change the conversation by evoking national security, nationalism, etc. It's a classical reaction of all leaders, right?
Endy, you get the last shot at this before we move over to our shot clock segment.
Look, you talk about Ann Applebaum's, and I actually think one of the reasons autocrats keep winning is we're focusing on them instead of looking internally. I remember a book that came out right before Trump got elected, Ed Luce's Retreat of Western Liberalism. I think those who believe in the Western liberal order are completely and utterly full of shit about why we keep losing. Completely. And I think this is why Imamoglu is such a big threat to Erdogan too. Mayors, and he's performed well, say, "Oh, I present a better vision." Until the proponents of Western liberalism say, "Yes, we are not going to lecture you. We're not going to tell you." How often have we heard, both in Europe and in the United States, well, the economy overall is doing well, but you haven't felt it at home yet. Well, who cares if it's growing at 3%, but you cannot pay your mortgage? Who cares? Who cares if you're achieving cost savings somewhere, but your health insurance goes up 200%? And, that's a debate. Ezra Klein just came out with a new book criticizing Democrats. And if you look at, and this is something that, especially here in the United States, if we have states like California, like New York, like Illinois that are completely blue and not delivering, the autocrats are going to keep winning.
On that note, I want to move us to our shot clock segment. You'll each have 24 seconds, like in the NBA, to answer the question. We'll go one by one, and we'll kick off with Henri.
Well, look, the three things to look for will be the extent of the demonstrations, the repression, because it has already started. The newspapers and television stations are being fined, so they will be closed down. But I think the clock has started on Erdogan's demise. I think 2 years from now, Erdogan will not be there.
All right. Lisel, the floor is yours.
Okay, I would say one thing to watch would be the way in which the Kurds are showing up to protest against Imamoglu's detention, I should say, in ways that I think that the Republican People's Party could have shown up for Kurds. I would say look to see whether there are any elite defections, anyone within Erdogan's group that are like, wait a second, the economy is going in the bad way, and don't look for the United States or the European Union because it doesn't matter.
A somber message for the Europeans watching and for those in Washington as well. But Nicholas?
I don't have 24 seconds of new material here, but I would just repeat the size of the protests, the extent to which the JHP remains unified in response, and how the economy fares.
All right. Endy, you have the last word on this one.
The markets. Watch the markets. The markets can bring considerable pressure. Watch if anybody tries to bail out Erdogan. In the last several years, he's negotiated a lot of credit default swaps. And then watch other competitors in the Arab world. How are the Saudis going to react? How are the Emiratis? How are the Egyptians going to react?
Thank you all for joining us. It's been great chatting with you. And to all our viewers, leave us a comment, share our video. We look forward to hearing from you and to catching up on our next episode.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Thanos.